Hey everybody, hope your week is going well. Hope you had a good Veterans Day. Looking forward to the weekend ahead. Tonight we are picking back up in Matthew chapter 25. We talked about last week the parable of the 10 virgins. Tonight we're talking about the parable of the talents, which is found again in Matthew chapter 25 verses 14 through 30. So when we think about again the background to this text, we recall again that this whole discussion this speech by Jesus really begins back in Matthew chapter 24, where he talks about the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem and his second coming as well. And he had ended the chapter, Matthew 24, by essentially saying the need to be prepared. The idea of being found faithful when the Lord returns. And that's sort of illustrated in the parable of the 10 talents as we talked about last week, the need for preparation. Because otherwise we see what the end result of not being prepared is, and that for the parable of the 10 talents, or for the parable of the 10 virgins, that was the fate of the 5 foolish virgins being locked out of the wedding feast at the groom's house, which is representative of those that are locked out on the day of judgment. Likewise, what you have in Matthew chapter 25, we might could think about this not just on the idea of the need for preparation, but how do we prepare, right? How do I know that I am prepared for the day of judgment? And if we think about that question in light of this parable, it can help us understand part of what the point of the parable is. All right, so that's, again, important to keep in mind the background to the text. So Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 14, Jesus gives another parable. And it begins with the fact that Jesus presents this man who is traveling into a far country. And when you think about sort of what's being described here, you can sort of get the connection that in a way represents Jesus, right? The man that's traveling into a far country, he goes to entrust his servants. We know that at this point Jesus is about to die. He's going to go not into another country, but he's going to ascend back to the Father in heaven, and that's where he currently resides, as we know. So in order to make sure that his kingdom is taken care of, the man that travels into far country decides to entrust, at least in this case, 3 different men with certain responsibilities to making sure that his possessions, the things that are his, are taken care of once he returns. And those are the 3 individuals that we have. One man who is given 5 talents, one man who is given 2 talents, and one man who is only given 1 talent. And so each of these individuals are essentially acting like stewards. They have essentially been given the possessions of the man, and they are responsible for not just taking care of it, but also producing and making things better. Again, we note that within this text, that verses 16 and 17, that the man with 5 talents, the man with 2 talents, they go out and they produce all that they can. And that's illustrated by the fact that the 5-talent man brings back 5 more talents. The 2-talent man brings back 2 talents. They both get everything out of what they had been entrusted with. But we note that the man with 1 talent decides to go and to bury the 1 talent that he was given, right? And 1 talent is obviously a lot less than what the other men had given. I didn't mention this, but again, a talent was generally a measure of weight. And a lot of times it had to deal with money. And even 1 talent was a lot of money. But if you compare 1 talent to 5 talents, certainly 1 talent's much less in that regard. So the man with 1 talent, he goes and he buries his talent. There was a custom that in order to protect your possessions, it wasn't that out of the ordinary to go and to bury what you have in order to protect it. And certainly this is a custom that those that were listening to might have known. The idea of going and protecting a certain amount of what you've been entrusted with to go and bury it, to protect it, so that way nobody could steal it. We might think about that. I know some of you may be old enough to remember, and maybe you had relatives that did this, but a lot of people lost trust in banks during the early 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, right? Because of the inability to go and to withdraw money from the bank because the bank had already given it out. So there were some people that resorted to burying their money, some that resorted to putting it under their mattress and things like that. But it was just done to protect what they had. And maybe that's what the one talent man in a way does. He's protecting what he has. And sometimes we might think that the one talent man is inherently lazy. But if you think about going and digging and protecting that talent, I mean, there is a little bit of effort, a little bit of work that goes into it. Maybe not as much work as what the 5 and 2 talent man did, but there was a measure of work that had to go in to go out and to bury that talent. It's not like he just left it laying around and didn't care for it. He did put some effort in. So verses 20 through 23, the king, or the man in charge, he returns, and he wants to check up and see how each of the 3 men had done. And the 5 talent, the 2 talent man, they have obviously produced what they should have. They're both rewarded in the process. As the text says, he refers to both men as good and faithful servants. And so because they have proven themselves with being entrusted with these matters, essentially they're given a greater responsibility, right? And so verse 23, and sums up with the 2 rulers thou hast been, the 2 stewards, thou hast been faithful over a few things, I will make thee ruler over many things, enter thou into the joy of the Lord. And so in a way we think about that with us as well, right? The idea that if we do everything that is expected of us on this earth in terms of our relationship with God and our work that is expected of us for Him, we can expect to receive something greater, right? And that's a home in heaven with Him. So both of those 2 individuals did that because they produced what they've been given. But the one talent man, though, doesn't. And the Lord notices that, and the Lord reprimands him for it, right? He asks where the talent is. The man goes and says that it's been buried. And even though he might have had the best of intentions in what he did, he didn't produce, and the Lord is not happy with him at all. As he indicated, verse 27, the least thing that you could have done was to go and to put it give it to the exchangers, and so that way he could have maybe not produced as much profit, but with the idea that maybe he could have gotten some insurance on it and produced a little bit more, even if he couldn't get a whole nother talent back in response. If it was just put into the exchangers' money, some benefit would have come from that, but he doesn't do that as well. And so verse 28 records that take therefore the talent from him and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. I'll go ahead and make this point here, but this is not necessarily a spiritual point being made here in that specific verse. It's not like if somebody fails to do what's expected of them that another person will receive their greater share of glory, if that makes sense, right? It's not like if another church member fails, if another member of the congregation fails in his obligation in his work, it's not like somebody else is going to be benefited off the failure of somebody else, like what's being given here. There's not necessarily a spiritual point being put in that, but something that could have happened in a practical sense in that day. If you're talking about the physical sense where they're handling the money from the king. So, right, that's the fate. The fate there is then of the man with 1 talent. Verse 30, he's an unprofitable servant. He's cast into darkness. There's wailing and gnashing of teeth. Certainly representative of what happens to those that are not profitable on the day of judgment. Their fate. Right, so when we think about the application, there are 3 things that I want to point out. One thing that is important here is that, the one talent man was not doomed eternally because he didn't produce 10 talents. It's likewise, right? The 2 talent man, He's not reprimanded because he didn't bring in 10 talents like the first guy who was given 5 talents. And the point being is that what was being measured there is how much they could produce based on what they were given. And sometimes we as Christians try to measure our abilities and maybe what we can do based on somebody else that might have more abilities or more things at their disposal. And it's not a really good idea to do that, because some people have been blessed more so than others in terms of not. And when we think about this parable, don't think about it just in the sense of the talents equaling your abilities. That's how it's talked about a lot, and maybe that's partially true to an extent, but really the talents representative here, not just your abilities, but your possessions, your money, your time, the things that you have. Is it all going towards is everything that you have in some way going towards furthering the kingdom of God? Some people are not as blessed as others. And so what's expected of them is only to produce based on what they have. They don't have to worry about producing as much as somebody else who is blessed with a lot more, because that's not how God views the matter. And that's important for us to keep in mind. We don't have to judge ourselves. We don't have to base our self-worth over somebody versus somebody who was blessed with a lot more. You know, if we've been able to produce what we can with what we've been given, then we are going to be pleasing in God's sight. We don't have to worry about judging ourselves in relation to other people. It also shows to us, this parable at least, that being spiritually pure is only half of the equation if we want to be found faithful with God. Right, the 1 talent man, we're not told that he's a very wicked man. We're not told that he's inherently an immoral man. You know, it's not like he's a great sinner who went out and wasted everything that he had. It's just the fact that he did not produce, right? He might have been a very good, decent man, but in terms of participating in the work of the church, he wasn't able to do that at all. And for that reason, he might have been a very good man, but you know, if you're lazy when it comes to maybe not lazy, but if you're not doing all that you can with what you've been given, then you can be as spiritually pure as you can, but you're missing out, right? You're missing part of what it takes. And then finally, again, this parable just goes to show, you know, make sure that what you have, you put it to good use. There are some people that take their, you know, that are hard workers, right? That in a secular sense, they work hard. Maybe they work overtime. Maybe they put in more hours, and maybe they're not justified in compensation with how much extra work they put in. And that hard work is important. It's a good trait to have, but you know, you want to think about how much of your time and effort you put into the work of the church, right? And so, you know, there are people that work extremely hard at their job, but when it comes to things pertaining to Christianity, it seems like they don't work as hard at all. And we have to keep in mind that God certainly God certainly would appreciate somebody who's a great worker in a secular sense, but if you're not working hard spiritually or working hard when it comes to the work of the church, well, you know, you have to think to yourself, why am I not showing that same work ethic that I do in a secular sense? Why am I not putting that forth towards the church? And so there is a principle here about, you know, what we have, making sure we take everything that we have and putting it as best as we can to the use of the church. And so that's sort of where we wrap up tonight. Again, the parable of the talents, there are a lot more things that we could point out from this parable, but we will go ahead and stop here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I'm not exactly sure which parable we'll talk about next week, but I'll try to have that ready in the handout on Sunday. But I hope you have a good week. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention this evening.